Now we move to another timely issue, but yet I guess they're all timely issues. But we've been seeing it a lot on CNN, on MSNBC, and all these major places. Brings me back to my own time when I lived inside of this region. And it's just something near and dear to my own heart. And so I welcome up our chair of our Israel-Palestine Task Force, our own Theresa Basile, to talk a little bit about what's going on in our Holy Land, what's going on in Israel and Palestine.
Thanks, Ben. I'm going to share something I wasn't planning on sharing because of what we've just been hearing. It was an action that happened in 2016, right after the Act of Repentance inside the Convention Center. The Native American International Caucus and UNKR had a moment outside together that we have now on our website. And it's a video on YouTube.
Today we looked at the sins of colonialism and the effects it had on the past and present lives of Native peoples. The taking of land for the use by others is called manifest destiny. If you look at a map of the United States and a map of Palestine, both have been slowly inhabited by another group of people, mostly by force. The Native people were placed on reservations in their own lands, and this is also happening with Palestinians. They are prisoners in their own land. We as Native people stand in solidarity with our Palestinian brothers and sisters. We understand their struggle to keep their land and identity. We must work to keep them safe, help them keep their land so that they can again be a whole community with homes, jobs, and educational opportunities for future generations. Let us as a church not stand back and watch this happen to Palestinians as in our past when we stood back when this was happening to Native people.
That out. I mean, the things that we were just hearing about colonialism in Hawaii, the intersections of our struggles, and of the peoples that we care about, it's very striking. And UNKR, but before I get to that, I wanted to say this is a particularly difficult time to be talking about what's happening in Palestine. And I think we know why, because of the horrors of what is happening there. Feelings are running very strong among many of us about the things that we're hearing and who we sympathize the most. But the pain that those of us who have friends and loved ones in Palestine, and especially in Gaza, are feeling, it takes this far beyond anything about ordinary activism and the ordinary struggle. And it also feels a little strange to be talking about legislation. That seems so far removed in some ways from the immediacy, the urgency of what's happening. So I hope I can convey to you why, in fact, what we're bringing to General Conference and what we need support for does address the urgency of the moment. One other thing I wanted to talk about is the elephant in the room for many of us, and people want me to talk about this even when what I've come to do is talk about legislation, is the war that's happening and how it started on October 7th with the Hamas attack. I don't have any easy statements about that right now, but I will say two things about that, two key points, and we'll move to the legislation. We need to question everything we're hearing from establishment or mainstream sources, including any news reports about that day or anything since. There's just been so much false reporting that's been debunked in the last few months, and that's been going on for years from the Israeli government. So we need to question sources. And more importantly, we need to understand that context is crucial in understanding what the Palestinians did that day. And if we think it happened out of the blue, if we think it came out of nowhere, then we don't actually understand what's been going on there. And that isn't necessarily each person's fault. A lot of that is down to our own media and our own government. They don't tell us what's going on there, even though we are deeply complicit as Americans in what is happening there. Most of us don't actually know. If we knew the assaults, the atrocities that are happening all through the year, every year, if we knew the hundreds and thousands of deaths, if we saw the conditions, the brutality, the slow genocide instead of the fast genocide we're seeing now, that the Palestinians have been subjected to, especially in Gaza. Gaza was predicted to be uninhabitable by 2020, back around 2017. It's gone well, I'm not talking about the war. Before the war started, it was past uninhabitable. That's the context of anything that has come out of Gaza. It doesn't mean that anything is excused or condoned. Violence against children in particular is deplorable, and we're horrified by it. But it doesn't excuse us from needing to understand, to comprehend what is happening to a people that would do that. And we need to see the bigger picture. We need to address root causes. And that, in fact, is exactly what UNHCR's work is about, and that is what our legislation is about. So I would invite you, if you want to know more of what I'm talking about, go to our website. It's still there in our changing banner. You'll see this picture, and it'll take you to our statement at that time, which is a lengthy statement with a fuller perspective on what happened. Also, and in where the statement is, there is a whole section now of materials that might be helpful in giving some perspective. But for the larger perspective of what is happening and has been happening for decades, would also suggest that you go to a section of our website on Israeli apartheid. All of these prominent human rights organizations have published in-depth reports in the last few years detailing and documenting the apartheid regime that Israel has created. And that is still news to a lot of people. But we have all of the reports collected and great resources to access them if you don't want to read a long report. Succinct things, handouts, and also videos. It's well worth learning about if you really do want to understand what's going on in the Homeland. So I would strongly recommend going there, kairosresponse.org, and in the navigation bar under education, it is apartheid you'll find that. So now to the actual presentation I came to bring in. What we are, UMKR, United Methodist for Kairos Response, where we are responding to the Kairos Palestine document. It was a cry to the world and especially to the church from Palestinian Christians back in 2009, intentionally named for the Kairos document of South Africa, which was Christians telling the world about the sin of apartheid and calling to the world to do something about it, and especially the Christian world. And when the Palestinian Christians did it, many of us did start to respond. And that is what we're endeavoring to do now, is respond to their cry, their request for solidarity. It's their struggle for liberation, and they're asking us to stand with them. Our goal is freedom, justice, and equality for all Palestinians and Israelis. So, getting straight into the legislation now. There are 3 resolutions coming to General Conference that have been very important in the history of our church that need to be renewed. They've been with us for a long time, and this is by far the most important, maybe the most important resolution our church has ever adopted on this region of the world. Opposition to Israeli settlements in Palestinian land. As you can see, it was first adopted in 2004. And so we're at 20 years now. To understand the importance of this legislation, and by the way, it's not just about the settlements, it's all of the infrastructure of these settlements enterprise. In other words, the occupation. That's what the resolution is about. The occupation specifically in the West Bank. Gaza has been under occupation when it was under siege for the last 16 years, but a different kind of occupation. And this addresses the occupation most people are more familiar with in the West Bank. So I wanted you to see more vividly what the occupation is, in case you never have been introduced to this subject. And it kind of sets the tone for all the other legislation, so we're spending a little more time on this one. One of the chief features of the Israeli occupation is the destruction of homes and communities. And there have been tens of thousands of homes over the last decades of this occupation, which started in '67. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, families have lost their homes simply so that Israel could colonize the West Bank illegally. a land that was under occupation and still is, and is meant to be given back to the occupied people after an armistice or any kind of agreement is reached. As Amy said, they never did it in Hawaii, and technically it's never been done for the Palestinians either. But this is just some evidence of what it does to people personally, and I hope it makes it more personal, and we'll be doing this all the way through the presentation, so that you can see these are real people being hurted by this occupation. And losing everything they have, literally. Children having this done to them and growing up knowing who did it, who the occupiers were. Imagine what that does to generation after generation. Another terrible feature is the destruction of nature and of agriculture, and that is a huge feature of the occupation. Over 1 million olive trees have been destroyed. And that figure was from at least 5 years ago. So who knows by now? I don't even have a current figure. How many, that's just olive trees, not to mention all the other agriculture that's been destroyed for the colonization of Palestine. And these trees live for hundreds of years, and they're almost like members of the family, because the same family, generation after generation, will care for the same trees. They love them, they are cherished by them. And the olive trees are a symbol of their people. It is embedded in their culture. So it is truly traumatic when the bulldozers come to destroy these trees. Not to mention all of the other agriculture that's been destroyed. And in an agricultural society that's decimating their economy and their culture, their communities. It isn't just, back when we were talking about homes, it isn't just homes, it's schools, it's clinics, it's community centers. Entire villages are destroyed in that infrastructure destruction. Probably the most, and by the way, I'm purposely projecting this, sounds like I'm shouting, because I want to make sure everyone can hear me. So I wanted to invite anyone who's having trouble at any point, if I stop projecting, just raise a finger to get my attention, okay? Denying freedom of movement, that is the most fundamental freedom there is, just literally being able to move. And not only move your body, but move from place to place. And it is severely restricted for the Palestinians. They live as virtual prisoners in their communities. This is a typical scene every day of thousands of men and women trying to get through checkpoints that separate them from each other, not from Israel. Not for Israel's security, it's to keep control of a colonized population so the land can continue to be colonized, so they can't resist it. Get to schools, to get to hospitals, jobs, to get to their own farmland, and to get to family members who are on the wrong side of the checkpoint. This is as the slide says, a vivid example of Israeli apartheid. That car with the yellow plate is an Israeli car. See the empty lane? It can zoom right through the checkpoint, and all of the other cars with the white plates are Palestinian, and they will wait hours to get through. And this is a daily occurrence. There is no semblance of a normal life when you're living under an apartheid regime. What we would call a normal life. There's some more of those. Even ambulances are stopped at these checkpoints, and there's no special permissions or given to them, no leniency for them, and sometimes they never get through. There's untold numbers of deaths and irreversible setbacks that have happened because of ambulances being delayed. And very often patients are forced to be taken out of one ambulance, taken through the checkpoint, and put into another one. And hundreds of mothers have had to give birth at checkpoints because of that. Some lives are lost, children are lost. And then water deprivation. Maybe the cruelest, to me at least, as one of the cruelest, certainly, aspects of the occupation. In a sometimes very arid land, especially in the summer, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians have no running water in their homes. Now, this is after decades of Israel controlling this land. And as an occupier under international law, they are responsible for the welfare of this occupied population. That is absolutely on their shoulders, and they do not provide even running water in many communities. So they do what they can to collect their own water. In the cities where they are lucky enough to have running water, it can be cut off at any time for days. They keep some tanks with water in them and pray that they will last long enough before it comes back on, and they don't know when it will come back. The water that Israel's using are aquifers underground, the West Bank. It's Palestinian water, and the Palestinians pay outrageous, exorbitant fees for it. So much so that water is now a luxury. They also aren't allowed to create cisterns or wells. Israel will destroy them, hundreds of them, because Israel is adamant about controlling every possible source of water. You can see what was done to that one. Oh, yeah, it's on the center screen now. And now, guess what this is? A settlement, right next door to some of those communities. There is no shortage of water in the settlements. They have all the water they want for swimming pools, green lawns that they can water at will, beautiful gardens, whatever they want, and the water is never cut off. And they don't pay the rates that the Palestinians pay. Another vivid example of an apartheid society. And then finally, we come to the settlements themselves, which are the cornerstone of the occupation and the whole point of the occupation, so that people can move in and colonize this land. And they are enormous. They've grown into big cities. They dominate the landscape in so many parts of the West Bank. And all of this is stolen land that people were forced out of, or their farmland was destroyed. But they're everywhere. There are upwards of 750,000 now, 750,000 illegal settlers in the West Bank. This is a view from Bethlehem of one of the settlements, one of the many that are surrounding them and strangling them. Like so many other communities there, they are losing more and more land every year and being smothered by them. This is an industrial park. Settlements aren't just for living in, they are for manufacturing. These industrial parks support the economy of the settlements, and they export to the world. And many of the products, well, at least some of them that you buy, you probably don't realize are coming from settlements. Wonderful thing that happened a few years ago, our own General Board of Church and Society voted to support a boycott of one of these companies. It was SodaStream, who many of you would be familiar with. And in fact, enjoy those machines. And they were manufacturing them on confiscated land in one of these settlements, manufacturing industrial parks. The boycott worked and they left. They got out of that occupied territory. More recently, UMKR joined a boycott of Pillsbury because they have a manufacturing plant in a settlement, and they also have stopped doing business there.
Good job.
Boycotts work. This is another way of looking at what the occupation has done to the Palestinians. And a lot of people have seen these four maps. We're just going to look at the last two. This land in the green, this is what the Palestinians had up to 1967, a whole lot less than they had in 1947. But in 1967, Israel started a preemptive war. You may have heard it called the 6-Day War. And when it was over, they had taken over these last bits of Palestinian land. And that's when what we call the occupation began. That's you can see on this last map what that has done to the West Bank. The tiny pieces of land that are now remaining, and those are shrinking every day and every year. Israel's colonization continues unabated. Netanyahu just announced in the last 2 or 3 days another few thousand units that are going to be built in the West Bank in the midst of this war. And there are all these articles saying how he's doing it despite how it will infuriate the US, and it never gets any real pushback from the United States or any other major power. So we're back to the resolution: opposition to Israeli settlements in Palestinian land. It covers all of these aspects of the occupation and others that I couldn't get to, and it states strongly our opposition to all of this injustice. And it calls for some important actions: a global boycott of products from the Israeli settlements. And specifically, it calls for all nations to ban the import of products from the settlements. It calls for ending all financial support for the settlements, be it banks or any other kind of financial support. And it calls for an arms embargo on the entire Middle East, which, as we know right now, has never been more needed. It's a very timely statement, and it's one that we've actually been making consistently since 2004. So not breaking new ground with it, but we do need to renew this resolution. This prophetic statement and call for justice by our church has defined our position on the Israeli occupation for decades, and it should be renewed in 2024. There are two more that I'm going to go through more quickly that also should be renewed this year. United Nations resolutions on the Israel-Palestine conflict. That was first adopted in 2000 and two more times after that. It's a pretty simple resolution. It says that our church supports some important justice resolutions that the UN Security Council has passed successfully when they weren't being vetoed by the US or someone else. And some rulings of the International Court of Justice, the ICJ. Now, we do say in our social principles, as of this moment anyway, that we endorse the United Nations, related bodies, International Court of Justice, International Criminal Court, the best instruments of law now in existence to achieve the law of justice and law. It's very consistent with our current positions that we do support these rulings and these resolutions that call, what do they call for? These UN statements. They simply call for that international law will be upheld and human rights will be respected and protected in Israel-Palestine. Nothing earth-shaking there. It should be the minimum standard of justice in our denomination. So we definitely hope that we would have to see a lot of support for that resolution. And the last one that should be renewed is Holy Land Tours. And that one goes way back to 1992. It's been a very useful resolution. Probably doesn't sound like a justice resolution, but in fact, it really is. Tourism can be a great tool or a weapon, or it can do harm if it isn't done well. Harm in ways that you might not imagine, besides the harm you can do when you're there and doing it badly. When United Methodists or others go there and are taken on the kind of tour that hides all of the suffering and the oppression, and plenty of those exist. There are tour guides who are very good at doing it, and one of our own past bishops had been on a tour like that and did not understand what was going on there in reality until GBCS took her on a trip and her eyes were open. But when United Methodists go on a trip like that, they come home thinking they've seen a very happy, lovely place. Then they hear us and others saying that things are quite awful for the Palestinian people and change needs to happen. And like, no, you're wrong. I've been there. I know. It's quite destructive to the cause of justice and peace. If people are going to go, we understand that the great impulse is in fact to see a very natural one for all Christians, to see the holy sites. And in fact, the theme that is used in so many, as you'll see here, is walking where Jesus walked. And there's no harm in that. In fact, those can be beautiful spiritual experiences. They don't have to be exclusive of hearing the voices of the people who are alive there now. Mm-hmm. You can combine those things. And that this wonderful resolution provides guidelines for us on how to do that. And some very simple guidelines that if we would live up to them, we could have an excellent experience of a biblical tour of our dreams, and at the same time learn some of the reality and come home understanding what is needed to achieve a just peace, and at the very least be a more informed citizen, but perhaps even become a peacemaker. So we ask that United Methodists hear the cry of Palestinian Christians who have been asking us for decades to come and see their reality and then come back and tell the truth of what we've learned. And UMKR calls that experiencing the Holy Land the United Methodist way. So that resolution also, we are hoping, will have strong support. All right, those are the ones to be renewed. This is our first piece of legislation that is brand new. And it is by far the most important because it would be the most significant and meaningful action that our church could take this year. Exclude government debt of countries involved in prolonged military occupations. I couldn't help thinking about just the title of this when Amy was talking about the fact that there's actually still an occupation of Hawaii. It has never officially ended. Although the ones that we're talking about are a bit different. But I would love to talk with her more about that subject. By government debt, we mean bonds. Just so you know, every time you hear that, because it's going to be coming up if you're going to hear any more discussions about this. and it does confuse people. Government debt means government bonds. Those are the things that we're saying, we should exclude from our church investments. And what are countries involved in prolonged military occupations? That sounds like a euphemism for just saying Israel, and it isn't. There are in fact other countries doing this also. There are 3 that we know of that the UN Security Council and the International Court of Justice have named. Turkey is occupying and colonizing northern Cyprus since 1974. Morocco occupying and colonizing Western Sahara since 76. And of course, Israel, colonizing Palestinian territory, which is the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza since 67. This have all been going on for many decades, with no signs of ending, obviously. And the crimes of these occupations are quite similar to what you saw in those slides. They have a lot in common. Confiscation and colonization of the subjugated people's lands, cruel and oppressive treatment of the occupied population with grave violations of human rights. So the question for us is, given what we know about these kinds of occupations, do we want our church to invest in and profit from these criminal military occupations? You would think the answer would be pretty obviously no. Westpath's human rights investment guidelines, their own guidelines, say Westpath also may exclude from investment, the sovereign debt, and I added the word bonds to remind you what that means, the sovereign debt of any country demonstrating a prolonged and systematic pattern of human rights abuses. These occupations, by definition, match that sentence exactly. So why would we even consider having the bonds of those 3 countries? It should be a no-brainer that we could agree on this. What we are asking is that this possibility that Westpath holds out become official policy, not that we might exclude, that we will exclude investment in the debt of these countries. So the way we would accomplish that is, besides the resolution that I was telling you about, which describes the reasons not to be in these bonds, we have a petition to actually amend this paragraph 717 in the Book of Discipline, sustainable and socially responsible investment. I won't go into the details of how it would be amended, and basically it would add governments to to a list of other things where we want to see human rights being upheld, if we're going to invest in. So, interesting thing is that even though it does seem to match with past policies, it certainly reflects our longstanding positions in opposition to Israeli settlements. That resolution that we've adopted for decades called for no financial support for the settlements. You know, when you invest in bonds of a government, you're investing in the government. And it's not some little piece of a thing that they do, that they have an occupation. It absorbs their entire national economy. It is what they do and what they are. When you are investing bonds in an occupying power, you are investing in the occupation. It's not like investing in a company that some little piece of what they does is of what they do. Some little bit of their business is over there in the occupied territories. We invest in Israel, we are investing in the whole occupation. We are deeply into it. So incredibly, to some of us, Westpath doesn't support this amendment that we're calling for. And in fact, they're telling every delegation we've heard that very thing. And what we have heard or read that they are proposing instead is engagement. Government engagement. We need to take that apart a little bit. Corporate engagement is something that shareholders, especially shareholders with a lot of holdings, will do with corporations to impress upon them the need to change their policies. They have some leverage because they own their stocks to do a better job on human rights. It's a long, difficult process to do corporate engagement. Once in a while, it has a little bit of a success. Very often it doesn't. We haven't seen a lot of success in that corner from Westpath, to be frank. But this isn't corporate engagement. This would be government engagement. They're suggesting they could engage with Israel, with Turkey, with Morocco, and get them to do what the United States, the UN, the European Union, and Russia has not been able to do to end the occupation. I mean, they never go so far as to say that, but when they suggest they would do government engagement instead of agreeing not to buy the bonds, that's an extraordinary proposal. I think because, I hope that from what you've seen, it should be obvious. We would not want to be invested in the bonds, in bonds that are funding these occupations. So this is a very important one that we hope people will bring to delegations in whatever way you can. Whoever you know, delegates that you know, and other ways of sharing this around the church. All right, another one that many United Methodists have adopted in their conferences. So it's been submitted, you can see here, there are 3 versions in the ABC, and each were submitted multiple times, as I understand it. Over the years, this resolution's really gotten around. And it is addressing another aspect, in fact, of the occupation. Israeli detention of children in the occupied territory specifically. 700 or more per year of these children are arrested out of the blue, often late at night, in the middle of the night when they're all asleep. This is one of the most common ways the arrests happen. Soldiers will barge into the home, drag the children out of bed, find the one that they were targeting. Very often they are abused and beaten in front of their family. The parents don't know what they're being charged with. They're taken away, put in a military vehicle, blindfolded, hands bound behind their back. Parents can't go with them. They don't know where they're being taken. Very often they're taken out of occupied territory, which is illegal, into Israel, which means the parents really will have trouble getting to them. And then that's when things really set in. They have no adult counsel or relative. They have no right to one with them. They are beaten and tortured while they're interrogated. They're put in solitary confinement for days and weeks. And eventually, of course, they confess to whatever they're being asked to confess to. It's almost always something that sounds innocuous, throwing stones. That's what they're charged with. But for Palestinian kids, that carries a sentence of months or years in a military prison. And it's for any child 12 years or older, those sentences. They are taken to what we would call kangaroo courts, military court system that is infamous for its lack of due process. Israel has the dubious distinction being the only country in the world that regularly subjects children to a military court system. And they do this with hundreds of children per year. Generations of, and they have a 99%. It's actually a little bit higher than 99%, just not quite 100% conviction rate, which is unsurprising. And you heard what the sentences can be. Kids are traumatized by this for months, years, or for the rest of their lives. And every kid that hasn't had it happen to them knows someone who has had that experience. So it's looming over generation after generation that this could happen to them. And this is to bring you a little bit of a sense of what it's like. These are, of course, not the night arrests of their homes. Those are much harder photos to get. That's just a few, I have literally hundreds, but it is one of the most egregious and heartbreaking aspects of life under military occupation. And I believe it is the first time it's come to General Conference because of the delays. And yes, okay, because of the different versions, we have a recommendation about this. The earlier versions called for the church, the 3 agencies of the church, GBCS, GBGM, and United Men in Faith, to come together to form a group that would do a study of how to bring this to our church, actions that they would recommend, and how they would educate our church on this subject and bring it back to the next General Conference. We really like that recommendation. We'd like to see that happen. The later versions ask for immediate actions by the US government, and those are good too. In fact, any version of this resolution that passes would be wonderful. But what we especially would recommend is that perhaps this later version to be focused on, and the action of the study and report by UN agencies could be inserted, added to in committee to this legislation. So that is our recommendation. But again, any support for any version of this resolution would be excellent. And child incarceration is a much broader and simpler resolution. It's about child incarceration around the world, which is becoming a serious problem in so many countries, especially the United States. I believe we lead the world for the number of children that are in some way or another incarcerated. And it also calls for those agencies to formulate a plan to educate United Methodists and recommend actions that we can take to help address and alleviate the suffering of children that are being punished in this way. And I believe we're at the last one, and where am I on my time?
You're way past your time,
Am I?
but that's okay. I don't, what do you mean?
Oh,
No, no,
okay.
no.
No, I didn't think I was past where.
No.
Okay. Protecting the right to peacefully address injustice. Doesn't sound, that also sounds like a euphemism, and in a sense it is. It means protecting the right to boycott. And it is becoming a threatened right all over the US and in other countries. As you can see, this one also has a newer version. And that one is the one we would recommend because it does provide more background and a broader global scope of this problem. Here's what I think might be a shocking fact. It should be. 38 states in the US have passed laws that penalize Americans if they support a boycott of Israel. 38 states will not allow people, if they will not sign a document pledging not to join such a boycott, they will not allow them to have contracts with the state or certain jobs with the state. In other words, they are denying them the same benefits that everyone else in the state can have because of their political beliefs and how they're acting on it. Blatantly, I can't read it.
13.
Thank you. Blatantly unconstitutional, often called McCarthyite. And there have been a few lawsuits that the ACLU has helped with that have been won, but so many of these laws are still on the books. And it is a growing problem in other issues now, because they've been so successful. Others who want to start other kinds of advocacy, for instance, stopping the proliferation of guns or addressing climate change by being fossil fuel companies. There are laws now being passed to forbid those kinds of boycotts or divestment actions. And they already exist now in a couple of states. So there's no end in sight to how this kind of action could limit our free speech and our right to use our money as our consciences and our faith dictate for us. It's worth noting, well, first, the great history of boycotts that we know have been so successful in addressing injustice. The bus boycott that Rosa Parks helped initiate in the civil rights movement. Gandhi used boycotts in his independence movement for India. Some of us in California might remember the grapes boycott that had a lot of support across the country. And of course, we know the power of boycott and divestment in the struggle to end South African apartheid. These are time-honored and very useful and nonviolent tools that we need to protect and preserve for our justice advocacy. We cannot have the government telling us that they will punish us for engaging in this. It's worth noting, as we just saw in that resolution, the first one we looked at, opposition to Israeli settlements. The Methodist Church called for a global boycott on those settlement projects. We are in violation of those 38 states' laws. We've divested from Israeli banks and from other Israeli businesses, and it's because of their violations of Palestinian human rights. And in fact, it was a real big deal back when that bank divestment happened. And New York Times and many other papers around the world made note of it, and that's why it was an important action for justice that actually helped the Palestinian people. Because when we take that kind of action, when it's economic action, and when it's as large an institution as we are, the world takes notice, so does Israel. And it's a meaningful action for us to do, and we could do it again with bonds. That's why people all over the country now are fighting for our right to boycott. So these are our resolutions that we're asking you to support. And one more time on my time.
You have 10 minutes.
Thank you. All right, they have 4 resolutions that we learned about more recently. That we are asking delegates to reject. And 2 of them are, well, at least one of them is very easy to deal with. Church funding and church rejected agendas. basically, I'll go back there. This resolution is asking that our church agencies withdraw their membership from a wonderful advocacy group. And that they no longer pay membership dues to them. And that group is U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. United Methodists helped found that group. I've served on the steering committee of it, as have many other United Methodists. And it's an excellent organization. Besides the fact that the resolution is calling for actions that can't be done, because the U.S. campaign no longer has any member organizations and there are no dues being paid, so nothing can be stopped. Aside from that fact, the resolution has some very defamatory statements to make about U.S. campaign for Palestinian rights, and they really do not reflect the understanding of our church leaders. They convened a task force on Israel-Palestine a few years back, and they studied a number of things that were happening in our church related to this subject. And their estimation of the U.S. campaign was that they recommended engagement for continued relationship with them, recognizing their commitment to equal rights for all, international law, nonviolence, and rights of refugees. So hopefully we can dispense with that resolution pretty quickly. This one's more troubling. It's rejection of anti-Israel blacklist. What they're talking about is that excellent action that Westpac took back in 2015, divesting from a couple of banks and putting 5 banks on a no-buy list. It's not an anti-Israel blacklist. What Westpac did was apply a human rights screen, a human rights standard to their portfolio. There were, I believe, 39 companies that were affected. Only a handful had anything to do with Israel. They weren't picking on Israel. It is by no means an Israel blacklist. This resolution calls for the banks to be put back on a buy list, to once again be options for investment. And it would send a terrible message to the world, especially at this time with what is happening there, all of the destruction that is happening, for our church to say, yeah, we want to go back to investing in Israeli banks. They are, in fact, deeply involved in funding and enabling the settlements and all of the occupation. And that is why Westpac divested from them. So we're strongly opposed.
Who's behind that?
Sorry?
Who wants to do that?
I'm pretty sure this is one of the 2 that came from Tanzania, which was a big surprise to us. There are 2 resolutions from Tanzania.
Interesting.
And they only showed up now in the supplement.
Interesting.
Yeah. I think we are trying to find out if the person is still in the United Methodist Church.
Oh,
And there's a big debate a debate going on that I've heard many different opinions about, and we won't get into it here, whether resolutions submitted by someone who has gone to the GMC will be in good standing or will be dismissed. Don't know for sure. Everybody's got an opinion. We'll see how that works out in coming weeks. So it is possible that it would be dismissed if that turns out to be the case. I'm not even sure if the person has left. So I heard something like that. Okay, the final 2. 5 minutes left? Thank you. The final 2 are both about anti-Semitism. And that is a very difficult subject. We have strong feelings about that too. It's very hard for me to consider voting against a resolution that purports to combat racism, or asking anyone else to do that. But both of these resolutions are deceptive and dangerous statements for our church, and we need to understand why. And this one is the biggest problem. It is asking our church to adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. It has become famous and notorious around the world. It is being adopted in many places. It's also being opposed mightily in many places. And that IHRA stands for International Holocaust Remembrance Association. That name carries a lot of weight with it. So the definition that has that name is treated with great respect. And it's understandable why some institutions and government bodies have adopted it. But just this month, the ACLU wrote again to our Department of Education asking them not to adopt it because it is being used so often, so badly as a tool to smother activism against Israel. So what's the problem with this definition? It starts off with a very simple definition. I don't even have the exact wording. It's not It's not what we focus on because it's not important. It's a rather innocuous, straightforward definition. But then it gives examples, and if you adopt the definition, you are adopting the examples that go with it. And some of those examples are the very kind of criticism that we and others of Israel, that we and others would do. And it gives those as examples of anti-Semitism. And if a government adopts the whole thing as their policy, then you are adopting their policy on anti-Semitism. It is being used over and over again on campuses, in political circles, in Europe and in the US as a weapon against activism for the Palestinian people. So it might be interested to know who is opposed to adopting this resolution. 100 organizations wrote last year to the UN Secretary General opposing it. Among those are Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the Presbyterian Church USA, Pax Christi USA, Jewish Voice for Peace, dozens of Jewish organizations, Basile, which is Israel's leading human rights center, and the General Board of Global Ministries. God bless them. So, oh, and one more person, Kenneth Stern, who's the chief author of the IHRA definition. He has been saying for several years now in writing and in webinars, he is appalled at how it's being used. It was never supposed to be adopted as government policy. And he is opposed to that happening anywhere or for institutions to be adopting it. It is being misused in terrible ways. So we strongly recommend voting against that resolution. And the other one was submitted, the other one on anti-Semitism has some good language in it. It was submitted by someone who we know has been, for over the years, has been dedicated to tearing down justice ministries in our church, John Harris. He has left the United Methodist Church. He's in the GMC. Same question arises, will this legislation stand? It has some parts of it that are statements our church should not be endorsing. And we hope that people will understand that, will realize that that makes all of it disqualified. It might be possible to pull out the worst parts of it and do something with what remains, but the best option would be to reject the resolution. So those are the ones that we're asking that you reject, and you will be receiving, all of you that are registered, you'll be receiving video eventually, links to the video of this, so you'll have these lists, and those are the ones that we support. I want to say one more thing, and I know I'm over time now. A lot of us have been wanting to do something for the people of Palestine in recent months. We need to be calling for a ceasefire. We need to be trying to get humanitarian aid. Doing anything we can to help the immediate moment. We also need to be doing what we've talked about at the very beginning, looking at the root causes of what's happening right now and looking at long-term solutions, trying to actually become part of the solution ourselves. We know we're part of the problem as an imperial nation and as the one that gives the primary funding and weaponry for what Israel's doing right now. We can become part of the solution if we work within our institution that we have a unique ability to work in, the United Methodist Church, and take some meaningful actions that the Palestinians are begging us to take, like putting the bonds on our no-buy list. And any of these other resolutions will be very meaningful to them. So I hope that we'll have your support on that. Thanks.